Billie Eilish humiliated at the Grammy Awards, but what she did next shocked the world. The 2025 Grammy Awards were poised to be a night of celebration, honoring the year's most influential artists. The air buzzed with anticipation as celebrities graced the red carpet, their smiles masking the underlying tension of competition. Among the night's top contenders were Billie Eilish, the young prodigy who had taken the music world by storm, and Beyoncé, the industry titan with a legacy that seemed untouchable. As the ceremony unfolded, an unexpected narrative began to take shape, one that would leave audiences worldwide in disbelief. The lights of the 2025 Grammy Awards beamed down onto the star-studded audience, shimmering against the dazzling gowns, designer suits, and high expectations. It was the biggest night in music, the pinnacle of artistic recognition, where legends were cemented and careers elevated. Celebrities filled the seats of the grand auditorium, each anticipating their moment, each waiting for the industry to decide their fate. Among them sat Billie Eilish, a name that had already rewritten the rules of pop music. Draped in an elegant yet effortlessly Billie-style oversized black and emerald suit, she sat beside her brother, Phineas, their bond as creative partners unshaken by the high stakes of the night. This wasn't her first rodeo. She had been here before, had swept entire categories, had walked away with arms full of golden trophies. But tonight, something felt different. The cameras panned to her face repeatedly, capturing her signature laid-back demeanor. But anyone who knew Billie knew that her mind was racing. 7 nominations. 7 chances to walk up to that stage. The album she had poured herself into, Hit Me Hard and Soft, had been a commercial and critical success. The numbers were undeniable. The artistry, unquestionable. Yet there was an unspoken tension in the air. Beyoncé sat just a few rows ahead, glowing under the dimmed lights, the room seemingly orbiting around her presence. She wasn't just another artist. She was an institution, an untouchable force. The industry revered her, and for good reason. Her newest album, Cowboy Carter, had pushed boundaries, a genre-bending masterpiece that showcased her ability to dominate any space she chose. But whispers had already begun before the night even started. Some insiders murmured that this year's Grammys weren't about competition. They were about history, about cementing Beyoncé's legacy in the one category she had never conquered. Album of the Year, the one award that had eluded her despite her decades of dominance. The one that, if she didn't win this time, would call the entire legitimacy of the Grammys into question. That was the narrative. And Billie Eilish was about to find out just how much narratives matter in a world where power dictates the winners long before the envelopes are opened. The first major award of the night came up: Best Pop Vocal Album. Billie's name was announced among the nominees. She clapped politely as the camera focused on her, the audience erupting in applause. Her heart pounded, not from nerves, but from anticipation. It was a category she was expected to win. The critics had called her album one of the most innovative pop records of the year. It had broken streaming records within hours of its release. This wasn't just a hopeful moment. It was almost a certainty. And yet, when the presenter opened the envelope, they read a different name. Sabrina Carpenter, Euphoria. A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. A few gasps. Billie's face remained composed, trained for moments like this. But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition. Something was off. She turned to Phineas, who gave her a small, reassuring nod, but she could tell, even he hadn't seen that coming. She clapped, smiling at Sabrina as she took the stage. But as she did, she caught a glimpse of Beyoncé, completely unfazed, chatting with Jay-Z as if the moment didn't matter at all. And maybe, for her, it didn't, because everyone in that room already knew how this night was going to end. The losses continued. Billie, nominated for 7 awards, watched as category after category slipped through her fingers. Pop solo performance, Song of the Year, Record of the Year. Each time the anticipation dwindled, the murmurs grew. She wasn't just losing, she was being shut out. The cameras, always eager for a reaction, zoomed in on her each time. The flashes of disappointment barely visible beneath her well-practiced poise. But she felt it. She felt the weight of something bigger than herself. And then came the moment that had been looming over the entire night. Album of the Year. Billie had won this category before, famously beating Beyoncé's Lemonade in 2020, an outcome so controversial that Billie herself had admitted on stage that she didn't feel she deserved it. She had praised Beyoncé endlessly, her humility both admired and scrutinized. Now, 5 years later, she was nominated again, against Beyoncé once more. And this time, the world had already decided how the story should go. The presenter took their time, drawing out the tension, milking the moment for all it was worth. And the Grammy for Album of the Year goes to... A pause, a knowing glance exchanged in the audience. Beyoncé, Cowboy Carter. The room erupted, standing ovations, cheers. But if you listened carefully, you could hear something else beneath it, an awkward hesitation, a sense that this was less of a victory and more of a coronation. The camera cut to Billie. She was clapping, of course, smiling, nodding. But for the first time all night, she looked tired. Because at that moment she realized the truth. She had never stood a chance. This night was never about celebrating music. It was about making sure no one questioned the power that already existed. Backstage, away from the cameras and the forced smiles, the energy was different. The noise of celebration echoed from the main hall, but in the corridors behind the scenes, there was only quiet tension. Billie Eilish walked with Phineas beside her, his jaw tight, his hands shoved into his pockets. Neither of them spoke for a few moments. There wasn't much to say. They had both seen it unfold in real time. It wasn't just the losses. Losing was part of the game. Billie had won before, sweeping entire categories in past years. She had never been one to expect anything, always understanding that the industry had its politics, its biases. But tonight was different. This wasn't about talent. It wasn't about who had the best album. It wasn't even about competition. This was about control. Billie could feel the eyes on her, not just from the people congratulating Beyoncé, but from others, the insiders, the ones who knew exactly how these decisions were made. She could see the quiet conversations happening in the corners, the knowing looks exchanged between executives and producers. No one was outright saying it, but the truth was obvious. The industry had decided long before the envelopes were opened. This was Beyoncé's night. She had been denied Album of the Year too many times before, and this year, the Recording Academy couldn't afford the backlash of another loss. The narrative had been crafted, the groundwork laid months ago. It was about legacy, about optics, about keeping the balance of power exactly where it had always been. Billie wasn't bitter. She wasn't even angry. She was something worse. She was exhausted. She could play the game, just like everyone else. She could smile, clap, act gracious, while knowing deep down that her work had never even been considered a real contender. But pretending came with a cost. A crew member approached her, hesitating. "Billie, you're up in 10 minutes." She nodded, adjusting the sleeves of her oversized suit. She had a performance scheduled, a big one. The Academy still wanted to use her for the ratings, to have her sing on their stage even after shutting her out completely. It was a familiar script. She was expected to be the good sport, the humble loser, the one who took it with grace, just like she had in 2020, just like she had trained herself to do every time the industry made a decision she couldn't control. Phineas finally spoke, his voice low. "You don't have to do this." She looked at him, eyes sharp. Yeah, I do. Because that was what they wanted. They wanted her to disappear, to be the footnote in someone else's victory. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Minutes later, Billie stood backstage, watching as Beyoncé gave her acceptance speech. The crowd hung on her every word, the cameras capturing every tear, every emotional thank you. It was a historic win, they kept repeating. A moment for the culture. And Billie understood. She respected Beyoncé. Of course she did. She had idolized her as a kid, just like millions of others. She knew that her win wasn't just about her, it was about something bigger. About breaking barriers, about a woman who had shaped music for decades, finally getting the industry's highest honor. But that didn't change what Billie had seen tonight. It didn't change the fact that people were scared. Scared to vote for anyone else. Scared of the backlash. Scared of questioning the power structure that had been carefully built over the years. It wasn't just about Beyoncé winning. It was about the fact that no one else was ever truly allowed to. The stage manager signaled to Billie. It was time. She took a breath, stepped onto the stage, and for the first time all night, she felt completely in control. The crowd erupted as the first notes of her song rang through the speakers, her voice cutting through the tension that still lingered in the room. She didn't perform for the Recording Academy. She didn't perform for the executives or the critics or the voters, who had already made their choices before the night even started. She performed for herself, for every artist who had been told, in ways both loud and silent, that their work wasn't worthy, that no matter how much they pushed, they would never truly be in control. She sang with a fire that even she hadn't expected, her voice carrying a weight that made the room shift. For the first time all night, no one was whispering. They were listening. And as she hit the final note, as the applause roared around her, Billie Eilish realized something. They could control the awards, they could control the industry, but they would never, ever be able to control her. The performance ended, but the energy it left behind stayed in the air, heavy and unshakable. Billie Eilish stood there for a moment longer than necessary, staring into the crowd. The applause was thunderous, but something about it felt different. It wasn't the usual standing ovation, the kind given out of routine for a big-name artist. This was something else. Some people were clapping because they were in awe, others because they didn't know what else to do. And then there were those who barely clapped at all, sitting frozen, the reality of the night pressing down on them in a way they hadn't expected. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every angle of her face, but Billie barely noticed. She had done what she came to do. She had let them have their night, let them go through the motions, let them play the game the way they always had. But for those 4 minutes on stage, she had broken through it. And no matter how much the industry tried to curate their perfect version of events, they couldn't erase what had just happened. She walked off stage, her hands slightly trembling, not from nerves, but from adrenaline. Phineas was already waiting for her, standing just beyond the curtain, his eyes scanning her face. "You just set something on fire," he muttered. Billie didn't respond right away. She knew it too. The Recording Academy had expected her to perform, take her final bow for the night, and leave quietly. Instead, she had given them something real, something they couldn't box in, something they couldn't spin, and that made her dangerous. As she made her way down the corridor, the whispers had already started. Industry people, executives, other artists, all pretending to be engaged in other conversations, but really watching her, talking about her. One producer she recognized from past events leaned toward another and muttered, "She's gonna be a problem after this." A problem. Not a respected artist. Not a contender. Not an equal. A problem. It didn't surprise her. That was how this industry worked. The moment you stopped playing by their rules, you became a disruption. And disruptions weren't welcome in a space where everything had been so carefully crafted to keep things exactly the way they were. She kept walking, her heartbeat finally starting to slow, but just as she reached the end of the hall, a voice stopped her. "Billie." She turned. Beyoncé stood there. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise from the main hall seemed to fade, as if the world had paused just for them. Billie had spent years looking up to Beyoncé, admiring her, respecting her, and she still did. That wasn't something that could change overnight. But right now, she wasn't looking at a legend. She was looking at another artist, another player in the same game. Beyoncé's expression was unreadable, her eyes scanning Billie's face carefully. "You sang with something different tonight," she said, her voice smooth but laced with something Billie couldn't quite place. Billie didn't break eye contact. "I meant every word." A flicker of something crossed Beyoncé's face. Understanding, maybe even respect. But there was also something else. Something unspoken. Billie wasn't stupid. She knew how this worked. Beyoncé hadn't built an empire by accident. She had fought for every inch of her success, clawed her way through a system designed to keep even the most talented locked in place. And now she was at the top. She had more power in this industry than anyone else. But that power came with something else. A responsibility, a weight, one that Billie had no interest in carrying. She didn't want to be feared. She didn't want to be a figurehead for the industry's carefully crafted narratives. She just wanted to make music, to create, to express, to be heard, not controlled. Beyoncé studied her for a long moment, then finally nodded. "Good performance." Billie nodded back. "Congrats on the win." Neither of them said what they really wanted to say. The moment passed, and just like that, Beyoncé turned and walked away, disappearing into a sea of people congratulating her. Billie stood there for a few seconds longer, feeling the weight of the night settle onto her shoulders. She knew what had just happened. She had sent a message. And that message had been received. As the night wound down, Billie could feel the shift happening in real time. She could see it in the way people spoke to her differently, in the cautious glances from executives who once greeted her with easy smiles, in the way some of the other artists, especially the ones who had also lost, looked at her with something that resembled hope. She had said something without saying it outright. She had made it clear that she saw through the illusion. And the truth was, a lot of people did too. They just didn't have the platform to say it. But Billie did. She had always been the outlier, the one who didn't fit into the industry's mold, the one who was never meant to play by their rules. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly why she was going to be the one to change it. As she left the venue, stepping out into the cool night air, she knew one thing for certain. They could give out their trophies. They could shape their narratives. They could try to dictate the rules. But they couldn't stop the truth from spreading. And tonight, Billie Eilish had just lit the match that would burn the whole thing down. The night was over. The cameras had stopped flashing. The red carpet was empty. And the Grammy stage, which had been the center of the music world just hours ago, now sat in silence. But outside, in the real world, the conversation was only beginning. Billie Eilish sat in the back of the car, her phone lighting up with notifications. Tweets, headlines, reaction videos. Everyone was talking about what had happened. Some were celebrating Beyoncé's win, calling it historic. Others were furious, calling the Grammys rigged, pointing out the pattern that had become impossible to ignore. But what stuck out the most were the messages from artists. Some she knew, some she had never spoken to, reaching out, thanking her. Not for winning, not for losing, but for standing in the fire and refusing to be burned by it. She didn't set out to start a movement, but sometimes the truth is the loudest thing in the room. even when it's spoken softly. She wasn't the first artist to realize that the industry ran on politics instead of talent. She wasn't the first to watch as history was rewritten right in front of her. But she had made a choice that few dared to make. She refused to stay quiet about it. And that's what scared them the most. Because the people in power don't fear artists who lose. They fear artists who lose, and still refuse to be controlled. The music industry has always been built on gatekeeping, on deciding who gets to win and who gets to be remembered. But what happens when an artist decides that they don't need validation from a golden trophy? What happens when they realize that the real power isn't in the award, it's in the message? Billie stared out the window as the city lights blurred past. This wasn't the end of anything. If anything, this was just the beginning. She would keep making music. She would keep telling her truth. And whether or not the industry ever acknowledged it, the people would hear it. That was what mattered. The fans, the ones who listened, who felt something, who saw through the smoke and mirrors. The ones who understood that music wasn't about charts and awards. It was about connection, about truth. And the truth was this: the moment an artist stops needing permission to exist, they become unstoppable. So now, the question isn't about Billie, it's about you. What do you see when you look at this industry? Do you believe the winners are chosen fairly? Do you think power decides success more than talent? Or do you think it's time for artists to take their voices back? Drop a comment below. Let's talk about it. Because the more we talk, the harder it becomes for them to control the narrative. And the truth? The truth always finds a way to be heard.